Last week Bob touched on some of those things that, when we look at those, sometimes we look at them as kind of odd, or we may seem that's kind of strange, but how did they get to that point? How did they get where they're at? So I hope that if I'm doing my job, that we're going to help you learn a little bit that you can approach when you're talking to friends or neighbors or whoever it might be. And that we can do it with the right spirit, with the loving spirit and such. So let's kind of dive in. I had some questions, so a couple things I'm going to touch on is some people had came up with some questions. This was one of them. They were wanting to know a little bit about councils. Really, a council is in essence really just a gathering of church leaders to discuss doctrine or discipline. Usually, in things to know about them, they're usually very focused. There were typically questions that came up that the church felt was important enough that they would get together or call these councils. In a minute, we're going to look at a few of the bigger councils, the more kind of important councils. So I want you to notice, if you just look at the number of people that came together, sometimes these things could go on and off for years at a time. But a lot of them, when they would do is basically they would bring in kind of the leadership from each of the churches. So when you see that there was 300 people, it wasn't typically like 300 from a church. That would be one or two from churches all over the country, all over the world that were coming together to talk over these issues. There's another word you'll see that's used. It's really kind of synonymous with councils. It's called a synod or synods. And it's really, the only difference is it typically tends to talk of more of a local gathering. So it would be, instead of all the churches maybe in the United States sending somebody, this would be maybe from Texas would get together. So just a smaller grouping of the same, but for the same reasoning. Really, the first known council that we had first appeared, or groups got together in the mid-100s and dealt with something. We've kind of mentioned this before. It's kind of a strange thing called Montanism. This was a guy named Montan, his last name, and basically he came to a church and had these visions along with a couple of ladies, these prophetesses that they called them. And they had vision, and really what they came about and started teaching is mentioned up here, that the Spirit of truth whom Jesus had promised in the gospel according to John was manifested to this man named Montanus. So he basically said, Jesus was talking to me through the Spirit directly. And it went on for a while. The church was obviously very much against it. So the first council in the mid-100s came together just to try to deal with these beliefs here. I believe from record it ended up, I think it to some degree survived up to the 600s before it totally went away. Now something that's kind of interesting, and you'll see a lot of reference back to this when the church is talking about, Catholic Church and so forth, talking about councils. They'll always go back to Acts 15 to say that that's, and in a sense, obviously, what's the big difference between the council or this get together in Acts 15 and a typical council? There's one thing that makes it totally different. What's the big difference in let's look at this really quick. So this is what they would call sometimes the Jerusalem Council. The Jerusalem, it's a meeting that was called up in Acts 15. We see it. The reasoning is that we're told in verse 1, it says, "And certain men came from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." So literally, we've talked about the changes in churches, but here we are in Acts 15, and we've already got some of what's going on in the churches. These were mostly Jews that were trying to pull in some of the old things from the Jews, from their beliefs, and trying to incorporate that into the Christians. So look at Acts 15:23. So basically here's the letter. And typically anytime a council came together, at the end they would write up a document or a letter that would then, all these people, the bishops or whoever came, they would take that letter back to their churches and read them. And that's similar to what we did. But here's a typical, or one that we see here in Acts. It says, "And they wrote this letter by them, the apostles, the elders, the brethren, to the brethren who are of the Gentiles in Antioch, Syria, and Sicily, greetings." Goes on down through that. And he basically says, when he's kind of replying to what they're doing. He says, "We have therefore sent Judas and Silas, who will also report the same things by word of mouth, for it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us, to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things, that you abstain from things offered to idols, from blood, from the things strangled, from sexual immorality. If you keep these from yourself, you would do well." So again, we're back to that question. What's the big difference in this group or get-together, or if you want to call it a council in a sense, and the rest of them that go on from here on out? I'm sorry? Right. Yeah. There. Okay. Yeah. There's your key word I was waiting for. This one, the only council that's or get together. This one had the apostles, which makes it legitimate, obviously, because it's coming out here. The rest of the councils had no apostolic people that were a part of them. So that's a big difference when they're trying to say these are really the same thing. Well, they weren't exactly the same thing, because instead of having some men get together, discuss it over and over and talk about it, here you had the apostles giving it. So. Yes, down in 28, for it seems good to the Holy Spirit and to us. Yeah.
All that there, now we have the Bible.
Yes.
So I wasn't raised in this. There are a lot of triggers that you're hitting on that are why somebody like me would move. The single biggest thing is the Bible, period, end of story.
Yes, sir.
It's not catechism. It's not stuff taken out of context. It's that everybody at the Church of Christ, whichever one I was at, sit up in the pulpit and drop the word from the Bible. That's the single biggest thing.
Yeah, good point.
Because their faith is just as strong as yours.
Right. Yeah, for those of you who couldn't hear, he's basically was saying, the Bible is really at the basis of it now for us, and the importance of following that. All right, these are just some. As we're looking through these, it's not the importance necessarily of the council itself, but just take a look at some of the years, the number of people in attendance. We'll just quickly go through some of these, kind of give you an idea when councils came together. There were a lot of, as we mentioned, there were a lot of other councils and synods that have met prior to this, but these are kind of the big ones that stand out. The church mentions, a lot of you have heard the Council of Nicaea in 325. It said around 318 were in attendance, and this was a big one. It dealt with Arianism, which really had, in a sense, denied the deity of Christ. So they came together to try to get this straightened out. But you look at how they also talked about the celebration of Passover and Easter, ordination of eunuchs, things like prohibition of kneeling on Sundays, the validity of baptism by heretics. So there's usually one main thing they're getting together, but as you'll see, and as we go through these, there's a lot of these big word isms. Some of these I didn't even take the time to get through them all. In 381, again, Arianism pops up again, but then they've got these other, as I was talking about, Apollinarianism, Sabellianism. Council of Ephesus in 431, another 200 or so people in attendance there. Some more of these big words, Nestorianism, Pelagianism, if I'm saying these right. And you got down to the Council of Chalcedon, 451. This is huge, over 500 in attendance at this one. Judgments issued, they were talking about, they were going back, because a lot of times what would happen is they would have a council and sometime later they would decide that maybe some of the things that were agreed upon during that council needed to be re-looked at. Here's one where they were going back and looking at the judgments that were made at the Second Council of Ephesus back in 449. There was a bishop that was had done some offenses. They were meeting to talk about that. Again, here's the Second Council of Constantinople in 553. Some more of these big words that they're talking about. It would be interesting. Like I said, I didn't take the time to go through some of these, but just to see what the basis of these were. Then we've got a Third Council of Constantinople in 680, another 300 or so in attendance for there. The Second Council of Nicaea. So if you notice, one of the things that I think is interesting, that I think really we can get a good lesson for us today. You know, these changes weren't going on overnight or weekly, or there wasn't, a year from now, all of a sudden they woke up and all these changes to the church had come about. You know, if we look, the Council of Nicaea in 315, now we're all the way up. We've had a handful of councils, now we're up in the 700s. They're meeting the Second Council of Nicaea, 787. But I think the thing that's important for us here, and we're talking about always trying to remember, the reason that we're here learning this, is that these changes aren't coming overnight necessarily. I was thinking back, if you were alive or back in the 50s, what the Church of Christ looked like. And if you would ask them some of the things that we see creeping into our churches today, would that ever, I don't think many of them would have thought there was a chance that would have came in.
The common thread I see throughout all of history is stamping out Satan's apostasy, and it's going on now. It's all over. There's a new one popping up every week, and that's what they were doing here, and that's what we got to keep doing.
That's a good point. So, John, if you couldn't hear that, he's basically said, stomping out apostasy by the devil is what they were doing here, and it's what we're still having to do today. Because you see it, they would come together. They might go 100 or 200 years before a big enough issue came together that they would feel like, because these would typically almost be worldwide issues. They would have people coming in. They would usually meet in Rome, but they could be in different places. And they would bring in a representative from most every church would come in. So these were big deals. But again, really at the base of all that, they were talking about, as we're talking about today, even today, I think it's important that we understand, that changes are going on. We're still in the restoration. I like to still think that we're still in the process of restoring the church. And if we're not good today at stamping it out, then 50 years from now, what's our church going to look like? 100 years from now, what's the church going to look like? So, good point. That it's just up to us to continually do that. It's not something that it just needs to be going on by others, but each of us needs to be looking at our church and saying, here at Woodland Oaks, does the church look like it did in the Bible? Does the church look like the example that was set? And if not, what do we need to do? Finally, the last one I just threw in this one, the Council of Trent, probably one of the most influential of all. It occurred way later, 1545. Reaffirmed, but really the Council of Trent came in because of the results of people like Luther and some of the Reformation movement. They finally had to come in and give their views. The church, in a sense, had tried to stay out of some of this stuff, but it had gotten to a point where they finally needed to come in and just give their views. So they condemned the Protestant Reformation as heresy. Again, I forgot to put how many people, but it was a large gathering. This one went on for nearly 20 years, on and off. They would meet. They would have to go back. There were different things coming up, but it was a big council. So as we move away from them, really the purpose of these councils or synods, one, meet to address a crisis. They typically weren't just general gatherings, as you saw. They were always something specific that brought them together. They would try to come to a biblical consensus. Creeds are typically what the writings or the letters that came out of these. They would write these. That would be their stance on them. They would go back to all the churches, distribute them. And I liked what one author said. He said in the end that they could be very messy. And it's the same thing with people. If you bring that many people together, there's going to be a lot of disagreement. There's going to be a lot of arguing back and forth. There's going to be a lot of stances, a lot of unhappy people. And that's what it was. It was just a gathering of people. And as we said, the big difference in these and what we see in Acts was the fact that the apostles were at the head of those. So today we're going to span a lot of time, and I apologize, there's so much mixed up in here that we could spend a lot of time on, but with the short time that we have. So today we're going to get ourselves all the way up to the cusp of the Reformation, which is kicking off in the early 1500s. But a couple things just to remember about it. We're calling them the medieval ages. You know, and typically we have, if we think back, sometimes we think about this might be as the Dark Ages, some of this part of the time. And so I encourage you not to think about, we're going to look at some things that went on in that, but not everything during this time was bad. It wasn't all corrupt. You know, not everyone in the church was corrupt. There were churches that were sticking by what they should be doing. You know, England is called out as being one that really at the time, compared to some of the other churches, had some solid church structures. And again, when I'm saying church here, I'm using this very loosely. We're talking about churches as a whole, not just like the Church of Christ or a conservative church, but church as a whole, church in England there. But some of the countries, it seems, had a lot more difficulties with their people. Other countries, such as England we're mentioning here, didn't see quite the abuse that some of the countries had. Here's just a couple of things. When we think about these times, you know, I just jotted down a few things. Some literature: Beowulf, Canterbury Tales, King Arthur, Robin Hood. So we got some important writings that came about in this time. Theology, the scholasticism, which is kind of this melding of theology with philosophy, had a big impact through the ages. Here's just two people. This list could have gone on forever. Thomas Aquinas, which says here, produced a comprehensive synthesis of Christian theology, influenced Roman Catholic doctrine for centuries, and adopted as the official philosophy of the church in 1917. So his impact carried forward for a long time. William of Ockham, the same thing, had a lot of impact in his writings during this time. And again, these people, if you could study them. Thomas Aquinas especially had a lot that we could have gone into if we had the time. You know, this was a time that many of the great cathedrals over in Europe, stained glass came about. The Gothic style of architecture emerged during this time. You may have heard about the Crusades. These came about in the early 1000s. Basically, the most well-known it talks about here took place between 105 and 1291. And this is where the European Christian armies attempted to recover. If you know, at this point, the city of Jerusalem was under Islamic rule. So there were all these holy wars that were going on to try to get these cities back that had been taken over by different groups. So historians try to, when they divide things, there's always just kind of arbitrary where they make the decision to divide them. Obviously, if you were living, in 498 and 500 hit, it wouldn't be any different for you. But when we're trying to just get dates, they try to break the medieval history into three sections, And the first one kind of picks up where Bob left off last week, or just a little after. So about 500 to 1000 most would consider the early Middle Ages. This is also the time that we kind of reference as the Dark Ages sometime. But something I didn't know, it's typically, I always thought it was more from a moral decline standpoint, but it appears that the Dark Ages really came about because there are less writings at that time, or significant writings, than any of these other times, and there's just not as much out there describing those time periods as there are some of the other ones. But there was a lot going on here, a lot of wars, national calamities. The fall of Rome was going on during this time. We started seeing modern nations start to take form. France, Germany, England started rising during this time. We had a big change in linguistics. From Latin to all the European languages started to come about. Then we've got the Middle Ages, or referenced as the High Middle Ages, from 1000 to about 1300. A lot of art and literature were flourishing during this time. These countries now started stabilizing. We started seeing the hereditary with the kingships and such passed along from one to the other, kind of like what we still see over in England. A lot of the Crusades we mentioned earlier were going on during this time frame. And finally, the later Middle Ages, the last 200 years that brought us up really to the time of the Reformation. Some things that went on, the France and England were in their 100-year war. This amazed me when I saw this. Of course, I'd heard of the Black Death hit Europe. But when I was looking at that in the history, some estimate 35 million people died from that. So as you can imagine, the impact just on these countries with that number of people. A lot of us have heard about the Ming Dynasty in China. It starts to begin, and during that time, Chaucer was writing Canterbury Tales during that time. Joan of Arc lived and was eventually, if you've seen her story, burned at the stake as a so-called witch. And as these latter Middle Ages, there's a couple of ways, and I thought that was kind of interesting, a couple of ways that the historians view this. The old kind of the view on this used to be that it was kind of a time of diminishing or waning church power and orthodoxy. The culture was in a slide. But really it seems like more now, they're really viewing this time kind of as a changing or a flowering of the medieval church thought. A lot of the writings that have been coming up to this point, a lot of the unhappiness with the church really starts to kind of take hold. We started seeing these earlier views that are expanded upon, they're fleshed out. And really a lot of the things, both positive and negative, emerged that kept kind of start ushering in the Reformation. People were just starting to get unhappy with the church, or had been for a long time. But people were stepping out, were writing things, people were starting to kind of call the church out on some of these things. So it really was a time that was kind of getting ripe for a lot of change that was coming about. So really, if we kind of look at this whole period as a whole, and again, we're taking a lot of time and kind of condensing it down, but really a couple of the main challenges that the church was facing during this time related to the structural challenges and the moral corruption challenges. So in structural challenges, there's something happened, we may have touched on this briefly, but it's called the Babylonian captivity or the Avignon papacy. And Avignon is a city in France, and this occurred between about 1309 and 1377. And basically what happened is that the Pope had always been in Rome. Well, they moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France. And it happened to a couple things. There was a lot going on in France. The papacy felt like they needed to be a little closer to have some control. There was a pope that was elected, and he refused also to leave and wanted to set up his in Avignon, France. So for nearly 70 years, the papacy was in this city here in France. But of course, there was a lot of problems with that. Everybody that lived anywhere outside of France started getting the impression that France was trying to take over or being co-opted. The papacy, there was a lot of abuses, going on with the church, obviously, during this time. So there's a lot of unhappiness. But it was kind of an odd time for the church that I believe this is the only time during the entire reign that the papacy has not been in Rome. This went on till about 1377. So finally they moved it back, and literally just as they got back, the Pope died. And so now they've got to come together, the cardinals come together to try to come up with who they want to be the next Pope. And there was a lot of pressure since this had been, I think, 7 popes they went through during that 70-year time frame in France. There was a lot of pressure on them then to elect an Italian Pope instead of a Pope that was French. So anyway, they did elect an Italian Pope, but the French cardinals revolted, kind of like it was kind of rigged to an extent. So they went back and elected their own Pope. So now we've got a Pope sitting in Rome, and now we have this Pope that's been elected by the French cardinals, and he's sitting in Avignon. There was even a short time where there was a third Pope that popped up. So as you can think to yourself, in this structure of church structure, the problems that are going to come about when now you're used to having one person that kind of sits, the Pope had been described as a time as the vicar of Christ. So their thought was there that if the Pope spoke, it was basically Christ speaking here on earth. So what do you do when you've got 2 popes? What do you do when you got 3 popes for a time? Who has the final say? Who's going to make the decision? What if something really important comes up to the church? If you go to one pope and he says one thing, what if the other pope says another thing? So this was considered for the 78 through 1417 a papal schism. A schism is really a divide or a break, is what that is. So this is also the time when people kind of got fed up with the fact that there's popes scattered around. So the councils, some of those tended to come up as being a little more important. They said, if we can't rely on one person out here to make our decision for us, we'll go back to the councils and we'll start letting them so the councils began to have more power during this time. This issue in early 1400s was finally resolved by a council that got together, the Council of Constance. But really by now, the mindset is really starting to get ripe for Reformation. People are getting tired of the problems they've seen the last 100 or so years going back and forth with where the Pope's going to be and who's going to make the decision. So people are really starting to get fed up with these issues. I want to give one guy that came out about in the early 1400s because he also made a big impact and kind of also gave people a view that there were some problems going on in the church. And his name was Lorenzo Valla. And he was really a fascinating guy. It's said that he may have had, from a standpoint, he was a linguist, a scholar, a humanist, he taught. But many have said that maybe from a Latin standpoint, he may have been the best Latin in the different, there were actually several different forms of Latin of any person that's ever lived. And his thing that he loved to do was take these older documents written in Latin. He started revealing there were some forgeries out there that people were using. But if you remember Constantine, he was the emperor that in the, 400s? If I'm right, or 300s, I may be getting one of those wrong. But anyway, he's the emperor that finally said that the Christian faith was going to be the official faith in Rome. And there was a document that surfaced in the 8th century called the Donation of Constantine, and it claimed to be written by Constantine back in his life, back in the 4th century. And really the big thing that this document did is that was written by Constantine, it tended to bequeath the temporal or the worldly authority of the Roman world to the papacy. Because currently, obviously, they had control over the religious side of the world, but this really said that not only is the Pope over the religious side, it's also over the temporal side or the worldly side. And so there was a guy in particular, this Pope Boniface VIII, which I always love his nickname, called the Bad Boy Pope. And he really took this document and ran with it and started to claim that the Pope and the papacy had jurisdiction and control not only over the souls of Europe or the European world, but also over the civil government. So he started getting involved in a lot of, at the government top level, started having to do with wars that he was dealing with, the rulings between other countries he was getting involved with. And he really came out and basically told all the rulers that they were subject to the Pope, which obviously didn't go over well for most of the rulers. And he had been using that, and then some people following him and that had been using that document. So Lorenzo Valla came up and started examining this document and realized soon that it couldn't have been written in the time of Constantine, and that in fact it was a forgery. And the person I was reading about this is kind of a light way to put it, but he said basically if somebody today had come back and said, I've got a document that Lincoln wrote, and as you're reading the document, there's a reference to like Facebook or something into it. We would realize immediately, and that's similar to what happened here. As Valla began to examine this document, he realized some of the linguistic parts of it couldn't have been written during that time, and it was a big deal at this time to be able to come back and say, this document that the papacy has been relying on for all these years to gain control over a lot of the other areas outside of the theology was in fact a forgery. So this kind of fueled that same fire that's going on with the people. They're getting tired of the papacy. Now they're realizing they've been relying a lot of their power on some document that really was forged. So then we also, as we mentioned, we also had moral corruption challenges. And again, as we mentioned before, not every church was facing these to the same extent. But a lot of the churches, this was going on. Something that we've mentioned a little bit, but just to kind of bring it up again. But simony, the buying and selling of offices. If you remember Acts 8:18, it says, "And when Simon saw that through the laying on of the apostles' hands, the Holy Spirit was given, he offered them money." So that's really where they're getting the name simony from, the buying or selling of office. Was Simon back in Acts. And even though it was not condoned by the church or the papacy, it was denounced, council after council denounced simony. In reality, it was going on. And it was very unpopular with the people. Basically what would happen is, so if you were from a wealthy family, but maybe you had a son that you wanted to get into a certain position, if you had enough money, you could pay him and get him into a church office. And obviously you can see a lot that goes on with that. So basically the rich could control who went into the office. Then that kind of led to something called pluralism. Sorry if you can't read that. Pluralism, which is really the holding of multiple church offices. Again, not officially allowed, but practiced anyway. Very lucrative. Because these people, say a bishop, they would get paid a lot of the money that was coming in through the church for being the bishop. So what they started doing was that they would buy an office over here, maybe in this town, and then they might go to another town and buy the bishop and put themselves in. So they would be in bishops over, say, 2 different churches, or even they could be higher up. Archbishop could be bought. So it was very lucrative for the holder, and this brought on, as you can imagine, something they called absenteeism, avoiding one's church duties. So if you can imagine, if I'm going to, lead this church bishop here, and yet I'm the bishop over at another church, and maybe I'm the bishop or the archbishop over in another area, I'm not able to really do any of my duties per se. So what they typically would do is go find someone that would do their day-to-day duties and pay them a little bit of money, and then they would take all the big part of the money for doing it. And it's another thing that was, very unpopular with just the lay people going on. They would see this going on. I was trying to get an analogy, and I really couldn't get to one, but I kind of thought about, if Sean, being our preacher, if say he was also came to our church, if he was the preacher and the only elder, and he made the decisions, and he comes and announces, next week, well, I've got a church down in Sugar Land that wants me to be part of them, and there's a church down in Galveston, or there's a church up in Magnolia. So what I've decided to do is I'm going to head them all up, and I'm going to come preach at each one of you each week, once a week, around the month, and then I'm going to have someone that's just going to fill in for me the rest of the time. So in a sense, that was what was going on, but yet I'm going to require all these churches to pay me the full salary that if I was there all the time. So people started really getting angry with the fact they're giving all their money and it's going to somebody that at times they may not even know who they were and never had seen them at their church. Another one that was really causing a lot of the lay people to get unhappy with, is the breakdown of celibacy. And the church had in place punishments for breaking rules by the priest, but there was such an overwhelming push to start letting priests get married that they passed this kind of a rule that allowed them to have a concubine, which, in looking at it, similar to what we would call a common law marriage in our today's society. But what they had to do, if you wanted to do this, you wanted to be able to have a concubine or a wife, you had to pay this concubinage fee, and this allowed you to basically break the church's rules and be allowed to do it. It says that it's estimated that 1/4 to 1/3 of all the priests and some of the countries had concubines. So again, it's the people looking at all these stuff that's going on and realizing, that the church is making, or that these people we've put up that are supposedly heading up our church are in fact, kind of breaking the rules. They're finding ways around it. Just as a quick reference, where they will place their on having, we may say, where are they getting the fact that the priests really can't be married and such? And one of the scriptures they'll go to a bunch, 1 Corinthians 7 through 9. This is Paul speaking. It says, "For I wish that all men were even as myself, but each one has his own gifts from God, one in one manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." So that's kind of the scripture rating where they get a lot of the celibacy that they enacted for the church. Another one was just greed. We've kind of touched on that. The people would pay all their tithes, just kind of like, if we were giving in that scenario we talked about earlier with Sean, and we're all giving to the church here at Woodland Oaks, but yet we see Sean once a month or whatever. It would start to bring hard feelings. You would start to reach a point where, maybe I'm not going to give quite what I used to give if I'm not going to get the benefits or see the benefits from that. There was this feeling that the priests were unchecked, something I didn't realize, but at the time they couldn't be brought to civil court for actions. They strictly, if they did something wrong or committed something wrong, it really had to be judged by the church, so the people would feel like, they're going to obviously not going to get the action they deserve because the church is going to be the one that's making the decision.
During these hundreds of years, the church that was actually established by Christ, was it kind of in an underground mode during all this, or was it non-existent in your opinion?
Well, I certainly think it was existent, yeah, and we're going to touch on that. I'll try to, because I think you mentioned that one time, and I thought that was a good point. But yeah, there are a few people that were, and I'll do that. I'll put that in next week as just a little bit. There's some people that'll pop up, some areas where people were still trying to stay with the Bible, and that's a good point. So if you couldn't hear, his question is where just the churches, like what we were a conservative church, where were they in existence? Because most of what we're talking about is obviously dealing with the Catholic Church and some of the offshoots to that. But that's a good point.
Pop up and try to go back to the Bible and things, and they get burned as heretics, right?
Yep, good point. Yeah, Andrew was saying, sometimes there were people that would come up and try to take the church back to where it should be, and a lot of them, lost their life as heretics and so forth. So some good points. Let me I'll finish this slide. We have 3 or 4 more, and I'll do those really quick next week, and we'll finish up, and then we'll jump right into, because this is going to kind of walk us, what we're really going to see on the next, and I'll say this, but really what we're going to see is really the kind of, these structural changes and the moral changes, had a lot of people unhappy with that. Luther, we're going to talk about, Luther wasn't the only person that was unhappy with this. Most of the people were unhappy with this. But the one thing that for Luther that kind of is what set him apart was the medieval view of salvation. So that's where we'll pick up tomorrow. Let me go back and just kind of close with these. These are finishing up with, the challenges of the latter Middle Ages. Again, at this point, most would admit there were a lot of problems going on in the church. Again, Luther was just one of many voicing concerns about these, and initially how the church looked. As I mentioned, he didn't really stand up his Reformation on structure or moral issues, but instead on the view of salvation. Luther would go on to say that while the Catholic Church didn't profess to believe in justification by works, that they really would say they're a grace-based system. He said once he really got into the system of it, that for him at least it amounted to a justification by works. Something I found interesting, up until this point there really hadn't been a single proclamation on justification which we kind of like to say just as my sin never happened, or sanctification, which is our transforming our bodies. That's one of them happens one time. Sanctification is kind of a lifelong process of transferring our likeness toward more Christ. So really the view on salvation had not been pinpointed or put down on writing up until this point. And we're going to see that due to the pressures that are brought on by the Reformation, that they'll finally, the Council of Trent that we talked about, that's when the church finally gets together and says, we've got to put our stance on salvation and how that happens. So that's when the Council of Trent in the 1560s. So again, next week we'll pick up right here on we're going to touch on the view of salvation from their standpoint, from the Roman Catholic standpoint, and what it was and we're going to jump then into Luther and his views on why he thought this system was really one of works as opposed to a grace system. So thank you. I appreciate your time today.